Everything that happened at Nick Reiner's court appearance that didn't make the news, plus why his defense lawyers have left the case and what's next. It's the Leonard Files podcast. I'm investigative reporter Eric Leonard from NBC Los Angeles, covering the Nick Reiner case, and this week, his second appearance in court, what was supposed to be his opportunity to enter pleas at an arraignment, but that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because Reiner's defense team, led by noted local private criminal defense lawyer Alan Jackson, withdrew from the case with the judge's permission. And now Nick Reiner is being represented by a deputy public defender in Los Angeles, and she's going to need some time to get up to speed on the case before anything can happen. So a delay like this isn't unheard of. Lawyers leaving a case early on isn't unheard of. Private attorneys leaving a case and being replaced by a public defender, also not uncommon. I'm not saying it's what happened in this case, but in many cases like it, it has to do with sometimes the defendant's ability to pay for private attorneys. And certainly Jackson is among, and his firm, lots of lawyers that work with him, are among the higher tier of paid private attorneys at this point. So we don't know. We're just guessing because whatever caused that to happen is not a public matter. But before we get to that, which everybody knows about that's been following the case because it was really the center of the coverage of the hearing earlier this week, there was a whole other event that took place in court that I thought was really interesting. It didn't get any coverage, and it may predict how this case goes forward from here on out. So I'm going to show you some sketches from court. These were done by Mona Edwards, our sketch artist that we hire over at NBC to help us when we are not allowed, not permitted by a judge to record in court. So I'm going to show you her sketches here. You can see Nick Reiner here seated in brown jail clothes. His hands were handcuffed. He's much more clean-shaven than he was during his first appearance. And in this view that Mona had from sitting at the end of the detention area, she had a very clear view of Nick Reiner, but it was from the side. She didn't see him straight on, as sometimes she can do when she's sitting in a different spot in the courtroom. So I'll leave these sketches running here for a minute. Last month, if you're following all of this, we reported, based on numerous sources with personal knowledge of this situation, that Nick Reiner had some time ago been diagnosed and was being treated for schizophrenia, and that something happened in his treatment sometime in what I can only characterize as a relatively short time frame before Rob and Michele Reiner were murdered on December 13th or 14th, but that's not entirely clear. And of course, we've been covering a number of reports that some people have described his behavior as erratic or confrontational right before his parents were murdered, and that happened at a holiday party at Conan O'Brien's house, but there may have been other instances of this. And the reason this is important and links back to what happened in court is that we know last month there was a medical order filed confidentially or under seal in court, so we can't read it, but we've been led to believe by the same people who talked about his mental health challenges that it has a lot to do with his defense lawyers, now former defense lawyers, concerns about his suitability for trial and his mental health condition. So based on all of that, let's jump ahead to the hearing this week. And before we heard from Jackson, Alan Jackson, the defense lawyer, that he was leaving the case, he talked to the judge about a series of subpoenas. He started this by saying, "Your Honor, we have a little bit of housekeeping we have to take care of," and turned to a discussion of 10 subpoenas that had been issued by the defense as part of its investigation or preparation for a potential trial. And I'll just say that it's a little unusual for this to be happening at this stage. Keep in mind, a subpoena is a court order. It's either the prosecutor or the defense being able to leverage the power of the court to compel a person to appear for testimony or a person to appear with records or documents. And that's how a lot of information that later becomes evidence gets into court. It's through the issuance of a subpoena. And if there's a chance that the subpoena is going to be challenged or worries that it might be ignored, the lawyers can ask for something called a body attachment, which is sort of an enhanced level of enforcement from a judge that says, no, you really have to do this. Otherwise, there could be consequences if you don't show up or the thing that we've asked for shows up in court. And again, what's unusual here is that in the proceedings we've heard so far, it is the defense that has issued these subpoenas. There are 10 of them, according to what Jackson told the judge. And he said this pertains to a defense investigation. So it's not uncommon for prosecutors to issue subpoenas during an investigation. After all, they're trying to collect information that may become evidence later on. But in this case, right after the arrest, right after the charges were filed, we now know that the defense team was issuing subpoenas, which is unusual in my experience for it to happen so early on. Typically, the defense team wants to review all of the material that's turned over by prosecutors and only later on begins issuing its own subpoenas to try to further investigate or look into other matters that maybe prosecutors didn't provide information or evidence on. So remember, just to put this in perspective, this is an early stage of the case. Nick Reiner has not even entered pleas to the charges that were filed last month. And if we look back at that court order filed under seal, the information we have from people directly familiar with what's going on in the case, and then this discussion of subpoenas, I don't think it's a big leap to imagine that the subpoenas that have been issued are not so much about the evidence of the murders, but may very well be related to issues surrounding Nick Reiner's health, his physical or mental health, and his condition. And those findings, whatever is produced as a result of the subpoenas, could very much have an impact on how this case proceeds towards trial. So back to the court. Jackson, and I'm going off my notes here, handwritten notes from court that morning. Jackson tells the judge that he wants to address this matter of housekeeping, tells the judge there are these 10 subpoenas, and ask the judge to enforce the subpoenas and in some cases enforce them with body attachments, which again is almost like a way of elevating the subpoena to a warrant, which would compel people to show up or produce particular documents to the court. Of the 10 subpoenas that the defense issued, 2 of the recipients of those subpoenas had their own lawyers in court during this hearing. Again, this is unusual. And those lawyers asked the judge to not enforce the subpoenas right away. And one of the attorneys said that they were making or planning to make a motion to quash the subpoena, and that is a way of getting them canceled. And there's reasons that subpoenas cannot be valid. And if you are the recipient of the subpoena and you hire an attorney and believe that you have a reason why this particular one should not be enforced, you can make argument about that. And in at least 2 of these cases, that is what these lawyers are planning to do. So the judge agreed, and again, this is before we even get to the issues with who's representing Nick Reiner or the possibility of pleas being entered. The judge agreed to delay the enforcement of these defense subpoenas and said that she would address all of this when Nick Reiner is back in court in February. And then Alan Jackson, again at this point still acting as Nick Reiner's defense attorney, asked the judge to not only seal the subpoenas themselves, but also any material that comes back to the court as a result of them. He said it pertains to an ongoing defense investigation, and if and when he is required, or a defense lawyer is required to share the fruits of these subpoenas with prosecutors, he said that would be done through the discovery process. So what does all this mean? Well, it seems like Jackson and his team spent a significant amount of time at the beginning of the case investigating something that probably has less to do with the evidence of the crime and more to do with their client, Nick Reiner. So we'll find out more about this as the case proceeds to court. So again, Reiner was scheduled for an arraignment this week, meaning he was expected to answer the charges against him, which are 2 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances for the murders of his parents, Rob Reiner and Michele Reiner. He was brought into court, and let me just run the sketches again here so you can see what this looked like. He's brought into court by sheriff's deputies. He is seated here in this view in a lockup area of the courtroom. This is Department 30 in criminal courts downtown LA. This is where most initial arraignments happen in downtown. And he is seated in the area that is barred off from the rest of the courtroom for defendants who are still in custody. He definitely looked more relaxed and calm than he did during his initial appearance in December, which happened like a day after he was arrested and charged. And at one point, I could even catch a crack of a smile at one of the jail staff. He was engaging with his attorneys. Here you see this view that Mona drew, Jackson facing away, the new public defender facing Reiner, and Reiner standing up at the window between the lockup area and the rest of the court. He seemed to be engaged with them during these conversations before the hearing began. And I should mention that the reason that there is a sketch and not video of Nick Reiner is that the judge allowed a pool camera, meaning a camera where the material would be shared amongst all of the media outlets who were there. The judge allowed the recording of the session, but ordered that Nick Reiner not be shown. And the reason for that is the defense, and again, this is still Jackson before we get to the rest of what happened, said that there is an identification issue in court. In general, don't know about the specifics here, that means that there are witnesses who still may need to testify or identify somebody, either in a lineup or in person or a photo lineup, something like that. It seems a little bit odd because there are so many images of Nick Reiner out there. It's not like this is somebody that the public couldn't see and see in the way he looked right at the time he was arrested. There were some still images of him appearing with his family. I think it was at the premiere of the movie Spinal Tap 2. And the way he looked there is very similar to the way he looked when he was arrested. So it's not clear to me exactly what the defense's argument is, other than we don't want to show him in jail clothes, which is understandable, but not usually a reason enough for a judge to prevent the public from seeing who it is. Although different judges decide these things differently. There's no right of the public to see video or still images from court. It's discretionary, and the discretion often, and should, lean in the favor of a fair legal proceeding versus the public's access. We certainly want public access, and we want to be able to show what happens in court, but judges make the decisions they make, and rarely are those challenged. And again, you saw in those sketches he was wearing regular-style jail clothes this time, not the self-harm prevention smock, which is like a Velcro vest that we've seen some defendants wear when there's at least an initial concern that they may try to hurt themselves. So certainly his conditions in jail have changed since we first saw him and he was brought into court. So the arraignment is supposed to happen, and there is a delay. So Nick Reiner is brought into court. He's seated in this detention area, and immediately his lawyers, and his lawyers alone, went into the judge's chambers for about 10 minutes. And to us, reporters who cover court watching this, that was a very clear signal that something was happening that had to do with Nick Reiner personally and not the issues in the case itself. And that's because whenever there are discussions between lawyers and the judge, both sides generally get to be there. And when only one side is represented, it's called an ex parte conversation away from the other side, and there are only a limited number of reasons why that's allowed. So just sitting in court and watching what's happening is sometimes as instructive as listening to what the people involved have to say. And in this case, watching the defense team alone go meet with the judge without the prosecutors was a signal that something was going on with their client, which, of course, minutes later we find out is a separation, the defense team withdrawing. But it's a good indication that there's something going on that has to do with the person they're representing and not the evidence in the case itself. So they come back to court after about 10 minutes. After there was the discussion of the subpoena, which I described a couple of minutes ago, Alan Jackson announces he and his firm are pulling out of the case. He says, "I must withdraw as counsel of record." And then he said it was, let me go back to my notes here. It was based on the discussion that we had in chambers, so referring back to whatever it was that they told the judge privately. Jackson told the court that the public defender had been informed and was ready to take over, and a deputy public defender who will be representing Reiner was seated in court during all of this, and she immediately walked over. Her name is Kimberly Green. She was seen in that sketch that was done by Mona Edwards, but I'll play you a little video of her in a minute. And she stood with Reiner. They had a very brief conversation, and then the judge agreed, "Yes, Ms. Green, you are now the counsel of record for Nick Reiner." Green asked the judge to order that all of the discovery in the case be turned over to her by the now former defense team. And discovery is all of the material that is produced to back up the criminal charge, which eventually some of it makes its way as evidence in a trial. The police reports, crime scene information, an autopsy report, interviews with now her client, if in fact police interviewed Nick Reiner, which rumor is they did for some hours before he was booked and formally accused of the murders. So the judge agreed to make all of the discovery transfer over. The prosecutor on the case, Deputy DA Habib Balian, who's also the assistant head of the Major Crimes Unit, said the protective order that covers all of that discovery information would, of course, allow Ms. Green at the public defender's office to get a copy of it and review it. The protective order, very common in almost all criminal cases, that the evidence, the potential evidence, doesn't get shared in public prior to it being presented in court. That means that anybody who sees this information prior to its use in court can't share it with anyone outside of the legal team. And then at the end of all of this, we heard the only words we heard from Nick Reiner himself during the proceeding. He's probably in court for about a half hour while all of this is going on. The only words he said is, yeah, I agree," when the judge asked him if it was okay that the arraignment that he had been in court to appear for would be delayed again, this time until February 23rd, 2026. Now, outside court, you probably saw a lot of our live coverage. The now former defense attorney Alan Jackson told everyone that he believes that under California law, Nick Reiner cannot be found guilty. I'm just going to show you a little bit of the video of what it looked like outside court because it was kind of a zoo. This is a shot of, you saw Caleb Mason there on the right. Here's Alan Jackson, now both former members of the defense team leaving through this crush of cameras and reporters, everyone hoping that he drops some other little tidbit of information as he's leaving court. He did not. He sort of reiterated what he said in an impromptu news conference earlier. That's a different view of it, but it just kind of gives you a sense of this crush of news people that had come in from all over the world. When I was doing my reports for Channel 4, there was a reporter next to me from the Netherlands. The BBC had reporters there. This has taken on quite a bit of international interest, and you can certainly see the number of media crews who are there trying to find out everything they can about what happened. That's sort of a wide shot of the DA Hochman. This is Kimberly Green. This is the deputy public defender who's going to be handling the case and representing Nick Reiner in all of this. She stopped and answered some questions. But before I go too far, let me go back to Alan Jackson and what he said when he walked out of court. It's a little bit long, but I'll play you the whole thing.
Withdraw as Nick Reiner's counsel. Circumstances beyond our control, but more importantly, circumstances beyond Nick's control, have dictated that, sadly, it's made it impossible for us to continue our representation of Nick. I'm legally and I'm ethically prohibited from explaining all the reasons why. I know that's a question on everybody's mind. We expect the public defender to step in. They've already been appointed and very capably protect Nick Reiner's interests as he moves forward through the system. But be clear, be very, very clear about this. My team and I remain deeply, deeply committed to Nick Reiner and to his best interests. In fact, we know, we're not just convinced, we know that the legal process will reveal the true facts of the circumstances surrounding this case, Nick's case. You know, a lot's been printed of late, over the last 3 weeks. A lot has been printed about Nick, printed about his family, printed about the circumstances. Speculation is in print. On December 15th, in the early morning hours, I was in New York at the time, and I got a call. Me and my team, we dropped everything. And for the last 3 weeks, we have devoted literally every waking hour to protecting Nick and his interests. We've investigated this matter top to bottom, back to front. What we've learned, and you can take this to the bank, is that pursuant to the laws of this state, pursuant to the law in California, Nick Reiner is not guilty of murder. Print that.
Well, Alan's always has a flair for giving us something that is notable. That statement certainly was. But I think it's interesting to think about the wording that he used there. He wasn't talking about evidence. He said the law means that Nick Reiner cannot be found guilty. And again, I'm making some slightly educated guesses here, but I get the feeling based on that, based on everything that we've reported about Nick Reiner's condition, the sealed motion, the subpoenas that have gone out that seem to have something to do with an investigation of his well-being. This all seems to be going in the direction of an argument being made about how responsible he can be held under California law for what happened. The district attorney came out a moment later. As you might imagine, the DA has a slightly different view of the evidence and the potential future of the case. I'll let you hear that. Here's Nathan Hochman.
We are fully confident that a jury will convict Nick Reiner beyond a reasonable doubt of the brutal murders of his parents, Rob Reiner and Michele Singer Reiner, and do so unanimously. Thank you very much.
And then he walked away. Lots of people were shouting questions. So that's kind of what you would expect. What I didn't expect next was the deputy public defender to come over and talk. The DPD, the deputy public defenders, and the office in general rarely discusses specific cases. We've interviewed them many times about broad issues in the criminal justice system, but as far as speaking about specific cases, it's rare. Which is frustrating for me because, first of all, we always want as much information as we can get. But when we cover criminal cases, they oftentimes become very one-sided in news coverage because the public defender generally doesn't speak and prosecutors often do. And not only that, in the early stages of a criminal case, the only thing we hear about in court is the prosecution side of things, the allegations, the charges that are filed, what the police department says about its investigation, and rarely do we get to hear the other side until a case gets to trial or afterwards, if in fact the case resolves itself, there's a plea, and then we might hear from the defense side. So it was refreshing to see the head of the public defender's office and then the specific attorney assigned to this case stop by and, although they didn't share a lot of specific information, at least be willing to address the fact that they're handling the case and they feel like they're fully capable of managing all of this. One thing I heard from Kimberly Green, the deputy public defender, that was interesting and notable is that I believe she says that the Reiner family wasn't aware this was happening until what happened in court happened in court. So I'll let you hear what she had to say. It's a little hard to hear because she's a bit off mic. I'll stop and start it if it's difficult.
It's not uncommon for private counsel to turn over cases to us, so no, nothing about that would complicate the situation. I have talked to him for only 30 seconds this morning, so no, I have no idea.
So there's a big exhaust there, but what she was responding to was a question from one of the reporters there who asked if she had had much time to talk with Nick Reiner before the hearing, and she said no, she had not.
I only spoke to Mr. Reiner for about 30 seconds this morning. I have no comment about his mental state. I have not.
And at that time, she was asked about Nick Reiner's mental state. She said she had no comment about that.
We've had no contact with the family. I don't think they were aware that this was going on until this morning.
At this point in time, Ms. Green will look into the case. We'll speak with Mr. Reiner. And if you have any further questions, reach out to our media team once we have more information ourselves. This just happened today, and my understanding is he was aware of it. Ms. Green spoke with him, as you heard. And as soon as we have more information that we can share, we will share it.
Thank you. No further questions at this time.
Thank you.
Well, that's that. So, again, it was nice to hear from them. It seems like they're interested in at least keeping everybody up to date with what's happening in the case. All right, so I'm going to leave it there now. Nick Reiner is going to be back in court, or at least he's scheduled to be back in court February 23rd. That's when, finally, we expect he will enter pleas to the charges. And that's sort of less significant than what happens after that, which is that the court will begin to work out a preliminary schedule for all of the pretrial stuff that happens. And then as that process goes on, we'll probably learn a lot more about how the case is going to proceed. In fact, even before that hearing, there could be additional motions or orders filed that give us some insight into what's going on, especially as it pertains to his well-being and whether or not he's suitable for the trial to go forward. So we'll stay on top of all of that. Please click subscribe on our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming updates. I'll see you next time.